Hello, my name is Bruce Wayne, and welcome back to one of my adventures. So the last time we were discussing that we were at Rock Hall with all five of us at Rock Hall after my father had left us essentially and sent us to Rock Hall with only $5 to go live with our grandfather who had checked out essentially. And so while we were at Rock Hall, as I explained before in my last episode, there was no food, essentially, so we had to kind of fend for ourselves. And so while there were bananas on the property and yams that you can dig out of the ground, and chickens you could find on the property that were running wild, they weren't cooked. There was no takeout back in those days, and we didn't have any money anyway. So I had to learn how to cook. But before I can learn how to cook a chicken, just like the movie Rocky, I gotta learn how to catch a chicken. And so that was very challenging to learn how to catch a chicken because they'd run all over the place. But I'll spare you the detail. You may have seen it in a movie or two that you really have to just run all over the place until you finally corner them and catch them. Once you catch them, then the next step is that you're gonna have to kill them and then you're gonna have to cook them. None of which I've done before because I was 8 years old, and up until that point, I was living in the lap of luxury and my mom was doing all the cooking. So you would think my other siblings would be, preparing the meals for me, etc. But it was kind of strange. There were times that they would do some things, but a lot of times that really, you had to fend for yourself, so you had to figure it out. So I think one of my brothers showed me how to kill a chicken before. Another brother showed me how to make a wood fire. But let's start with the chicken first. So the chicken when you catch the chicken, you had to get a bucket, and you had to get a bucket and put it over the chicken, and then you cut off his head, and while the chicken is moving around, which sounds pretty freaked out to somebody who may love animals that's watching, at the same time, you can't just let the chicken just fluff around on the ground. You have to also make sure you have a pot of boiling water. Simple enough, right? You simply go in the kitchen, you turn on your stove, the flame comes on, the water boils, and voila, you're there. No, you're not. You have to make the fire. So you gotta go out and get some branches, some bigger logs, and put them into 3 squares, and you have to get some paper, so you have to find paper wherever you could, rip them up and throw them in there, and throw these little smaller twigs in there. And here's the thing about it. Many times, you didn't have the abundance of lots of matches, and there was no gasoline or kerosene. So you had to learn how to make a fire with just maybe 1 stick of match. And then many times, you only had a stick of match, and if you had more than a stick of match, you had to keep them sparingly, because if you're out of a match, you're out of food. So I learned how to light a fire with just 1 stick of match, and you have to sit there and blow on it. Once you get those things, you have to keep feeding the fire until you get a flame going. Now, once you get a flame going, you put the pot on there, and you start to boil your water. Now, so one day, when I killed one of the chickens and I'm sitting there, I'm cooking it, and this is in my early cooking days, my 8-year-old cooking days. I was there and I took the pot cover off the pot. But the problem is that some of the steam had some water that was still settled on the top of the pot cover. It was a pretty considerable amount of it. And it went down and it landed on my thigh, and I had the biggest blister on there. And also, just run to the doctor, Bruce. No, there's no running to the doctor. You got to figure it out as well. And so for quite some time, I had this blister on my leg until it went away. Some of the other things that I'll tell you about is when I actually how I learned how to swim, for example. So we would also always go down to Sandy Gully, and down by Sandy Gully there was a pump. A pump as in a water pump. This is where you get the water supply, the drinking water supply for that community. And so there's a dam that's there. And Wayne, my brother, when we lived in Bridgeport and Edgewater with my parents, as you remember before from one of my stories, I told you that Wayne was sort of like a fish. Whenever we would go out swimming, Wayne would be that dot that would be way out there on a log or something out there, and my parents didn't really care. They just knew that he was a good swimmer. And so when we went to Sandy Gully down to the pump, Wayne said, well, you're gonna have to learn how to swim, because everybody was jumping in the water and swimming around, and I didn't know how to do that. So what he did was he said, look, here's your instructions. You're gonna jump off the side, off the ledge. You're gonna kick your feet and paddle your arm. And if you're drowning, I'll save you. That was all the instructions I got for swimming. So forget all the swimming lessons, ladies and gentlemen, that you've gotten. Those were my swimming lessons. And let me add another layer. These water supply had huge pumps that were pulling the water through. And we had heard stories about people who went in there and swam in there, who the pump would pull them under the current from there, and they would drown. So there was also that risk involved. But the reason why, even though I knew that it didn't bother me at that time is, number one, you're young and fearless, but number two is because I trusted Wayne. My brother I trust him explicitly that he would save me if something happened. And then I jumped off in the water, kicked my feet and paddled my arm, and that's how I learned how to swim. Now, one of the other things that was interesting is, if you remember in one of my episodes, I told you that when we got up to Rock Hall, we didn't have any electricity. So at some point in the equation, my brother was able to Colin, my oldest brother, was able to communicate, get word to my mom that we didn't have electricity there. So my mom sent money to turn on the electricity there. So we actually had electricity. And by the way, just to add on a sidebar note, while we had water, which was really good that we had a water supply, many of the people in that neighborhood that did not have water supply. So they actually had to walk, they lived further up the hill, many of them, and they had to walk down the hill, walk all the way down, go way down to the water supply, a water supply close by, but not that close by, and then get the water, put the water on their head, and then walk all the way back up that hill, all the way back home. Talk about getting in shape. You're going to be in really good shape because you have your balance and the water on your head. And sometimes people would have a bottle of, not a bottle, but a container of water on their head. And sometimes they're also carrying water in their hand as well. So, and they're walking up a hill and it's hot out, etc. And they were able to get it done. So needless to say, people were in pretty good shape from a fitness perspective there. Now, one of the things is I still, even though we were living in Rock Hall, I was still enrolled in school. Of course, school is now in the other parish. School is in St. Catherine, over very far away from where I was. And so I actually, back in Independence City, in fact, and so which was quite it's the next, essentially the next state over. So I had to make my way to school. And so what I would do is, for some reason, I don't remember how we got money. Maybe my mom must have sent a few dollars for money. I don't remember that part, but I do remember when it was time to go to school, there were two shifts. That I guess maybe because of the amount of volume of student that went to the Independence City all-age school that was essentially primary school that I attended. Maybe there was just so many kids. They had what was called morning shift and evening shift. And so what that meant is that some students would come to school from like 7 o'clock in the morning till about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or 12 noon, I can't remember the time. And then the next shift would come in and would go from like 12 noon to about 5 o'clock. So that was sort of 5 or 6 o'clock, I can't remember, but it sort of branched off that way so that they could accommodate the volume of students that were coming in. And so me leaving Rock Hall to get, if I was on the morning shift, that was okay, because then I'd have to take two different buses, and that's one of the things. To get to school, I had to walk from where I was walk by the graveyard, walk straight down to the square. You get on a bus that's on a schedule, of course, and then you get down to Kingston. Then you have to take a second bus that took you all the way across town to school. And it took quite a while, like maybe 2 to 3 hours before you finally get to school. And so you'd spend an awful lot of time on the road getting back and forth to school. And these buses were never really on time because of the distance. So even if you got to one point and you got there at a reasonable time, the next bus could be late. And so that happened a lot. But what really happened was I actually ended up on the evening shift. And so getting to school in the morning was fine. But then coming home, the bus would be late, you would end up on a bus would break down, and so then you were on the last bus out or a second to last bus out, and you didn't want to miss the last bus because then you would be stuck in downtown Kingston. You'd have to sleep in a park, which I saw lots of people do, but I didn't want to find out what happened sleeping in the downtown park in Kingston, which was not very safe even at that time many years ago. And so you get from Independence City to Kingston, essentially to get on the bus to go to St. Andrew, to go to Rock Hall. And when you get there sometime, the bus would be late. You get on the bus, and by the time I got to Rock Hall, sometimes it would be very late, like 10 o'clock at night, 10:30 at night. When you live somewhere where there's not a lot of electricity, people go to bed very early. And so you get there and it's extremely desolate. You don't see anyone at all. And what was really interesting is the neighborhood that we lived in, it seemed like nobody else lived down in that area because I don't ever remember too many people walking in that direction. So what would happen is that you'd start walking and it would be pitch dark, but you'd have that one last light that you'd walk by. And then after that, you would get to the point where you knew it was the last light and until you got to your house. And so you started walking, and look, I'm 8 years old. I mean, I'm a city kid, but you've heard lots of stories, and every little sound is it's kind of scary out there, and you're walking in the dark out there, and there's lots of these stories about half man, half bull, and they call them rolling calves in Jamaica. It was just sort of a mythology. But at the time, we didn't really believe in that stuff, but I was a little bit more concerned about what I didn't know, the unknown. And so you're walking in the dark out there, and then, you'd make it fairly well until you got to the bottom of the hill where, and then from the bottom of the hill, we had to, our house was much further up there. And so you'd start running from that point, and you'd be screaming because you have to go by the graveyard because my family had sold part of the property to this graveyard that was next door, immediately next door, that you had to pass by in order to actually get into our home. So you would start running from the bottom of the hill, running by the graveyard, screaming, "Open the door! Open the door!" And you hope somebody would open the door to let you in. And at first there was only a lamp at the time because we didn't immediately have electricity. So you didn't, they could just turn out the lamp and that was it. There was nothing that's going to come on there, and you had to run all the way in there. And eventually we got light, and that was helpful when you finally got there. But that's essentially what every evening on an evening shift would feel like. There was nobody going home with you at that point to escort you home. And, God forbid, if you bump into someone in the dark out there, it's going to scare the hell out of you also. Now, after having several of these experiences, and nobody seemed to be interested in whether or not I went to school or not, I just stopped going one day. Because my siblings had stopped going to school also, and eventually I just stopped going. And what was interesting about that is that there was no accountability there. I literally just stopped. And I did not end up going to school. When it was all said and done, I did not attend school for about a year and a half. And apparently those year and a half timelines were the time that I was supposed to learn basically, a certain level of English where you put in your commas and where you put in your periods and past tense, present tense, all those kind of things. And so it took me many, many years, and even to this day, sometimes I struggle and say words in the wrong tense, or I have to really pay attention to things to make sure I'm putting the right commas in the right places, etc. So it had a very lasting effect on me because of that experience. During that time also, you could do whatever it is you wanted to do there within reason. So, one of the things is that we used to, my brothers, we would go to the club, and because in Jamaica they had, the culture was that the different, what they call like if you had a stereo system and you had a band or sound system and they hired you to do it. These guys used to compete with each other to see which set was louder than the other one. And so a lot of times when you go to the clubs, one club is not just playing music just for the people in the club. They were also playing to compete with any other club that was close by to drown out the other clubs. So needless to say, the music was very, very loud, but I could go in, there was nobody at the front there asking what's your name, and it was free to go in, and so I was able to go in there. And I remember one day just, being in the club and climbing up on one of the speakers, and I fell asleep on top of the speaker because I guess I was listening to the bass, and it just kind of lulled me to sleep. I mean, can you imagine your 8-year-olds going to a club and fall asleep on top of the speakers? And also back then, pretty much, there was no restriction for alcohol. So if you could reach over the counter and you had money and you could pay for it, they'd probably serve you there. But there was no interest from us. None of us were interested in drinking alcohol either. So that was also a non-issue as well. We used to shoot what was called bamboo guns. So essentially, if you think of a bunch of boys primarily with no supervision at all, if you left them out in the wild that they could do whatever they want to do, then that's what you ended up with. And so we would shoot these things that were called bamboo guns. And we're not talking about the little tiny bamboo, we're talking about those big bamboos, and you get like a 6 or 7 feet piece of it, and then you kind of cut out one area there and you pour kerosene in there, you punch a hole all the way through there, you'd open up the end of it there, and then you would light the flame, and when it built up enough gas, I guess, in it, or steam or whatever it is, when you did something which I can't remember right now, I think you put the flame on it again and it's and it would just make this really, really loud sound. Well, that's how the kids were doing it up there. They were doing bamboo guns, and you'd hear it all the time. However, when you get a bunch of city kids involved and you get my genius brother Colin involved, we took it to the next level. So we started to experiment. So rather than just having just the gun making that loud sounds, we started to take objects and put in the front of the gun. And so we would take cans and put it in there and it'd fire off the can. And I remember it fired off the can so hard that the can actually went and hit a banana tree and took the banana tree down. The banana tree went like over like that. And so some of the other things that we experimented with is like spray cans, where it says, do not incinerate. Well, there's no parent supervision, so throw it in the fire and see what happened. And so that we did all of those things, trying to experiment, trying to see what worked and what didn't work. Needless to say, we had developed a very bad reputation with the neighborhoods, with the neighborhood and families in that neighborhoods, because a lot of the parents were really concerned that these kids, these unruly kids, these bad breed Rasas had come to Rock Hall and were influencing their children. It was debunking their mythology and was really influencing a lot of them. So eventually, instead of just us going down to Sandy Gully to hang out, after a while, we had a lot of kids that were going with us, that were sneaking off away from their responsibilities, and they were going down to Sandy Gully. And one last thing, when you went down to Sandy Gully, it wasn't like we were just on my grandfather's property. There were all these old timers were no longer farming the land, so you could just go miles and miles from one property to the next. Now, up until we got there, a lot of these kids were told, oh, you can't go on that land over there because it's so-and-so's land. Oh, you can't go over to so-and-so's land. You know, oh, this one guy was in World War I or World War II, and, you know, if you go on his land, he might shoot you. But we knew that those guys were old, they haven't been down to Sandy Gully in years, and nothing was going to happen. And so we told all the kids, come on down with us, let's break all the rules, and let's have some fun. And they joined us, and we had a blast. So that's my Sandy Gully story. Stay tuned for the next time when I'll tell you about another adventure I had. My name is Bruce Wayne. And don't forget to check out our app, our Easy Weight Loss app. Don't forget, I am Bruce Wayne, and I've helped thousands of people to lose weight, get in shape, and to have amazing body transformation.